get to our very last section, access.
Yeah, the question of access will really speak to our previous discussions about technology and knowledge, both always haunted by infrastructures that are often unequal, if not outright discriminating.
Julian, you probably remember even better than me the beginning of the internet, the golden days of World Wide Web pioneering, when the internet emancipated from its roots in military technology, and there was this great hope that the internet would bring universal access.
Yeah, back then access was largely seen as a technical issue.
Yep. This debate has now shifted because it became clear that being plugged in is not everything.
Exactly. It also matters who has access to what and who controls the infrastructure, marking a growing division between content and value producers, which is all of us here today. Look at this festival, and those who aggregate and extract value from this collective production. Look at the platforms we're using to come together in this strange kind of way.
Right now, all of us are working for free for Facebook, Zoom, Telegram, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. That is both great because they enable our strange kind of togetherness, but really problematic at the same time because we have no self-determined control.
This section then investigates new models of participation, tools to challenge structural inequalities, and engages critically with digital and analog modes of production.
We will start our section with a project presentation by the Feral Atlas Collective with Lili, Carr, and Feifei Zhou that experiment with forms of mapping that can draw human and non-human collectives together. They will not only share their project, but also, I believe, some insights from the Feral Atlas workshop that they have been running during this festival.
Yeah, please stay with us for a minute. I will now join the Feral Atlas Collective behind the scenes, and if all is good, we will be back with you in just a minute.
And I will meet you right afterwards in the panel discussion during the Q&A with the panelists. So don't forget to send all your questions in the Telegram group and be part of the debates. So see you in just a sec.
Hey, we found each other and we found you again. So we're all live and that is great. And I would like to welcome the Feral Atlas Collective, which is represented today by artist and architect Feifei Zhou and architect in natural sciences Lili Carr. It's really great to have to have you with us. And I personally feel really close to and even a bit envious about the work you have been doing with the Feral Atlas project and now with the Feral Atlas workshops. Will you also share some of the impressions from the workshop that ran alongside this festival?
Yeah, we will.
That is fantastic. So before I hand over to you, I would point out that we will do Q&A on Telegram after the session. And both of our fantastic speakers will join Telegram after the session for this purpose. So that's really fantastic. And with that said, I would like to hand over to you, Lili and Feifei. You can take it from here.
Thank you,
Julian.
Thank you, Julian, for the introduction.
Great to have you.
On February 20th, 2015, researcher Kelsey Nagy took a walk following a cow named Shilpa in the Goklan neighborhood of Mysore, Karnataka in southern India. It's a typical day for Shilpa, and Kelsey traced her route around the neighborhood, foraging for food and water, strolling on the streets and taking breaks. Kelsey used her phone to record this route that Shilpa took, which I've combined the photos to create this map that you're seeing. It shows that Shilpa made multiple stops at dumpsters to seek food. Indian cattle provide income for urban farmers, and they're seen as sacred in Hindu culture, for turning agriculture and human food waste into milk, labor, fertilizer, and other byproducts. While feeding them waste is considered as normal locally, the scattered plastic bags constituted by polyethylene in urban environments gets consumed by these cows on a daily routine accidentally and release toxic chemicals that enter human bodies through cow meat, milk, and other forms. As polyethylene does not decompose, they stay in our bodies and also can be traced everywhere, even in soils and plants. Here's a selection of Kelsey's photographs she took on her journey. These photos show how plastic bags spread their toxicity through water, soil, and flesh, which are living things that became partners with plastic pollutants and enter the food chain, whether non-humans or humans. In this story, the plastic bags are what we called a feral entity. The way they partner up with other non-human companions in order to emerge, proliferate, and spread is what we call their feral qualities. The dumping of waste is ubiquitous. Not only plastic bags, dangerous waste is accumulated and distributed by humans in many forms, whether garbage, toxins, or radioactivity. The undesired products of our fast advancing society to the ecological world. They are the product of the Anthropocene. In Feral Atlas, we call this transformative action dump. Consider it as a verb. Since the mid-20th century, humans have created indestructible toxic waste on a vast scale that could no longer be disintegrated by nature. Feral Atlas collects a number of videos to convey the similar anthropogenic actions of dump. For example, look at this dump site, landfill site where garbage was collected and gathered, as well as videos of nuclear waste gets stacked, as well as plastic left outside factories and industrial waste such as tiles being left in the wild and acid mine drainage that get leaked into streams and rivers. So these actions achieved by human-made infrastructure programs that technological apparatus on certain scale. Other than dump, there are many other similar actions of infrastructure works that essentially alter the land, air, and waterscape around us and cause the spreading of these feral effects. So those verbs, just like dump, are what we call tippers, infrastructure-mediated state changes. They describe the infrastructure processes that radically change environments to the point where our social and ecological systems are tipped from one state to another. We follow the thread of infrastructure works and start to imagine this critical era that we're currently in, we call the Anthropocene. To achieve so, after numerous sessions of discussions and research with the rest of the editorial team, I juxtaposed real historical and contemporary landscape modification projects across time, location, and scale together, and drew a series of fantastical illustrations which present these world-making processes together. Look at this drawing that depicts the aftermath of the Great Acceleration, where Earth systems have been radically changed by infrastructure projects. Here we see the dumping of plastic waste, which is the infrastructure host of the feral entity plastic bag that we just discussed, as well as infrastructures such as container ships that accidentally introduce different species such as comb jellies to in their ballast water to other ecosystems, as well as pharmaceutical companies that has been discharging their effluent into our rivers and seas, as well as pork factories that has been used antibiotics in feeding those pigs, as well as radioactivity leaked and released from nuclear power plants, and many more infrastructures. Behind each infrastructure that you can see with the gray dot hides a feral entity and a first-hand field report. Each illustration shows a world triggered by a particular set of historical conjuncture, and together they form the Anthropocene. In Feral Atlas, we call them Anthropocene detonators, and this one is named acceleration. Feral Atlas argues that the human-built infrastructures, whether industrial or imperial, creates ecological effects that develop and spread beyond human control. These undesigned, unexpected, and out-of-control effects are the Anthropocene. The plastic bags is merely one entry of the Atlas.
Feral Atlas is a digital humanities experiment in studying and viewing the Anthropocene. It's curated and edited by Anna Singh, Jennifer Dieger, Alda Kieleman-Saxena, and Feifei, together with a group of researchers and designers, including myself, and many other makers who helped us make the Atlas come alive. It was published just a month ago by Stanford University Press and is available here as an open access website.
We're seeing, as Lili scrolled down, it's just a full list of all the contributors and collaborators we have in the team. Also on this title page, you see a web page covered by traces of virality. These are charcoal and pencil drawings that are made of a combination of disintegrating cells and viruses. If you look closely, they're coronaviruses, not to scale. Whether you're browsing this, while you're browsing on this first page, you encounter Feral Atlas. They're infecting and damaging the digital ecosystem from your screen. So your Feral Atlas journey has begun.
So when you land on the site and click enter, you will land on this page of jostling feral entities, each of which is studied by one of the 79 reports in the atlas. So if you mouse over any of them, you'll see which Anthropocene detonator world they belong to. Let's pick Sudden Oak Death. Sudden Oak Death belongs to the Anthropocene detonator world capital. And here you can find it hiding in commercial tree nurseries, which have transported the disease overseas. Capital is a world that sees ecologies as resources for human use, converting land, air, water, organisms, lives, and livelihoods into commodities through imperial and industrial programs of factories, inventory warehouses, and plantations. And exploring around, we come across an industrial plantation of orange trees. And zooming in, hiding within it, we come across the feral entity of bee villains. Clicking takes us to the tippers page, and this is grid, where the infrastructural action of gridding is designed to simplify land and ecologies in an effort to make them more productive and more efficient. Yet the action of grid gives rise to non-designed feral effects, such as the spread of pests and pathogens, species survivors and species survivors that thrive while others are destroyed. Scrolling down, you come across a very glitchy video of a corn harvest from Illinois in the United States, which was made by artists Bruce Rhodes, Trevor Birkenholtz, and Armin Link. And when you scroll down, you will find other videos made by these artists and other Feral Atlas contributors that also express the infrastructural action of gridding in different places and scales and manifest across different ecologies. And below these, you will find a tipper poem, which is written by none other than Feral Atlas editor Anna Singh. At the bottom of the page, you can either explore some of the other feral entities that have flourished as a consequence of grid, or you can click forward to the field report. And this takes you to a field report written by biologist Marcela Cili Santos, who follows bees and farming activity in Anomalia, the fruit-producing capital of Colombia. First, we land on a flow map, which in Feral Atlas, we call a map that attempts to express the spatial and temporal dynamics that inform the feral dynamics and activities of bee villains. This is a map that Marcela and I made, and it shows some of the 70+ bee species found in Anomalia from Marcela's research. The diversity of sizes, shapes, and colors of species depicts the many ways in which bees relate to the vast diversity of flowering plant species blooming there. But simplified landscapes and agro-industrial plantations are expanding, creating hostile zones for many insects and driving their declines. So notice how the bees are disappearing. Marcela observed the order of this decline over the course of her fieldwork, and many, mostly solitary bees, have disappeared before they've even been identified at the species level. Only 2 survive and flourish. You'll have to go onto the Feral Atlas site to see which 2. So scrolling down. So when you scroll down and are reading the report, you will hear about how the 2 surviving and flourishing bee species are perceived by local farmers as both aggressive villains that threaten their tranquility and their crops, but also work as essential pollinators in place of lost species. And as with all feral atlas stories, multiple angles from a multitude of perspectives and disciplines and practices are required to tell these stories richly. And if you dive into the materials, the visual materials, or the hidden materials, clicking on feral qualities, and also by exploring the poems hidden on the site, you will kind of come to see all the different contributors and kind of perspectives that are contributed to telling the stories in these reports. And at the bottom of each report page, you have a choice. You can either revert at your own risk, which takes you back to the page of jostling feral critters, or you can click on the super index, which you can also get to by clicking on the key anywhere in the site. So let's go there now. Yes.
So on this page is what we call the super index, which is a master index that shows all the key concepts of feral atlas and their associations. So if you mouse over any choice of feral entity, the index will give you its corresponding combinations in the atlas, such as which Anthropocene detonator belongs to on the top, and which tippers it creates on the left, and what feral qualities it holds on the right. Similarly, if you mouse over, say, invasion, the index will provide all the combinations that belongs to the world of invasion. Be mindful that this is not a fixed set of categorizations. This is only an index of guidance that can be taken beyond. This is why, if you look closely, there's another layer of text just kind of floating beneath this super index, which we call the soup. They show other possibilities of terms in the atlas, such as net, tailing, avian flu, and so on and so forth. And if you keep going down, underneath this super index, you'll find an overview of all the essays written by contributors, editors, and collaborators. And also, if you go further down, there's a list that displays all the feral entities and the watercolor critters we drew, which we call this the chocolate box, quite literally. All of them are displayed in gray except the ones you visited. And if you see reputations, they are same entries written by different authors. We invite you to visit and activate all of them.
At any point in the Feral Atlas site, you can click on these 3 bars at the bottom, which take you to essays written by the Feral Atlas editors, makers, and contributors. And these essays are also held in the reading room. And we would like to draw your attention in particular to the teaching section. Feral Atlas is intended as an active tool to think with and work with and to use as a jumping off point for research and further studies. And so these are ideas and exercises and readings, reading lists that have been written by the Feral Atlas editorial team and other contributors for using Feral Atlas in courses and workshops across disciplines. And Faye and I adapted this section, which is Feral Atlas exercises, connecting the material to the place where you live, for an online workshop we ran this weekend here at Dragging the Human earlier today, and yesterday at the Making Matter Symposium at the Het Nu Institute in Rotterdam.
So Feral Atlas argues that to study the Anthropocene, we need to follow feral effects. And to follow the feral effects, we need to notice what imperial and industrial infrastructures do. So the workshop was an experiment in using Feral Atlas to notice what's around us, using Feral Atlas as a verb, which is also the title of our workshops.
So the workshop was a prompt to everyone who took part to go out and observe the action of tippers, meaning the dumping, burning, gridding, taking, piping, smoothing and speeding and crowding work that infrastructures do, which radically transform land, air and water, but that we have stopped really noticing. They've become a totally normalized part of our daily lives. So we each went out for a coronavirus socially distanced walk in the area where we live to try and observe and record and express the actions of infrastructures at work in our local areas. And everyone was invited to use whatever method and material and recording device we each felt comfortable using. And here you are looking at the collected recordings from the workshops over the past 2 days. And you can see that there are a lot of photos and some videos, but there are also sound recordings and poems. And I think now we can maybe talk about some of the ones that we really, I mean, they were all amazing. And it was so interesting, actually. I think we both learned so much from doing this. And yeah, Faye and I will show you some of the contributions.
Yeah, so there's this one taken by Katharina Soek-Welting from the Netherlands. I don't know, yeah, if it was still showing screen. So it's a very simple picture of just a fruit stand, which we can see everywhere. But this picture really triggered us to think about the commerce behind the plantation and shipment of fruits and vegetables, whether they're grown in industrial farms or greenhouses or even labs. So these are all kind of infrastructure work that's kind of created this sort of simplification created by grid. And looking at another one created by Anne-Kathrin Goossen in Germany, which is one of kind of a picture she took outside this botanic garden in construction. But what's quite interesting is botanical gardens are a typical case of taking kind of exotic plants from one place to another to showcase. So in the process of taking and transferring, they're introducing these kind of other species that sometimes become invasive to the local ecology. But then if you look closely, there's also wooden pallets just kind of in the little courtyard. So we're seeing the taking of living things and as well as non-living, so wood in kind of two forms. Both the processes are in a way transferring pests and pathogens, fungi, viruses, and so on and so forth.
This is quite an interesting one. So this is a photograph of something that's not there anymore. And this was taken by Zeenath Hassan in Copenhagen. And she was telling us how in Copenhagen, they used to use a particular kind of salt to de-ice the roads and pavements that they then realized actually was, containing toxins, toxic chemicals, which of course, when the ice melted, ran these chemicals off into surface runoff, and then these chemicals enter the ecosystem. So now this particular kind of salt has been banned in Copenhagen. And actually there is another one, which is also kind of trying to capture something which we can't see. And so this is, these are quite beautiful photographs taken by Antea Oestreicher in the town where she lives in Germany. And she's a master's student who studies lichens. And lichens are notorious air pollution sensors. And certain species flourish depending on the levels of pollution in the air. And she was telling us how actually over the course of the pandemic and lockdowns, she's noticed that certain lichen species that weren't there before have started to flourish, which she thinks indicates a possible drop in air pollution. And this is actually a really nice one to end on, because in Feral Atlas, we have the fantastic Jennifer Gabris also writing a report about her work with lichens as sensors. So we invite you to go onto the Atlas and explore this too. But yes, this is the collection, the collective work. Oh, wait, maybe I can show one video actually. Sorry. Oh, maybe not.
We can take it from here, I think. I just wanted to share one comment from the Telegram, because it kind of sums up my reaction. It's from Sasha, and Sasha says, I really love the Feral Atlas project. Thank you so much for making it happen. So I want to extend that thanks, and also thanks for sharing what happened this weekend at this workshop that took place in so many places at once, which is also kind of fantastic and weird. And yeah, I happen to work with experimental publications quite a lot, and I just really love the way that you can play with different ways of ordering in the online publication. It's such a rich experiment in storytelling. And I think there's 357 people in the Telegram room who are really looking forward to meeting you there for the after session Q&A. So thanks for agreeing to join us there. And thank you again for this fantastic session. And now I'm handing over directly to Vera Sacchetti in our next and final panel discussion on access.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the panel discussion around the topic of access. It is our last big theme of the day, and we're very excited to be here in the cable room of the Medientheater at ZKM, an appropriately apocalyptic environment for us to have this last discussion of theme discussion of the day. My name is Vera Sacchetti, and I am critic and curator, and also the program coordinator of the Driving the Human initiative. And I'm here today, very, very happy to be surrounded by incredible people. I have Sasha Costanza-Chock next to me, and then I have also Claudia Fales, also a little bit further. I will introduce them briefly and jump right into the discussion. Sasha Costanza-Chock is a researcher, designer, activist, and seasoned educator. They work to support community-led processes that build shared power, move towards collective liberation, and advance ecological survival. Sasha is a research scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, both at the Media, Arts, and Sciences at the MIT Media Lab and the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. They hold numerous other roles and have authored several books, journal articles, book chapters, and other research publications. Their newest book, Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need, was published by the MIT Press in 2020. Claudia Fales is an expert in democratic innovation, deliberative democracy, citizen participation, and populism. Her research and writings touch on these issues, but they also touch upon European and Canadian politics, elections, and public opinion. She leads the OECD's work on innovative citizen participation, which explores the paradigm change underway towards a more participatory, deliberative, and collaborative governance. Claudia co-authored the first OECD report on this topic, which was published in June 2020. I'm so excited to be talking to you today. We were exploring different kinds of epistemologies just now, and there were talks of a crisis of knowledge, ideas of humans as a multitude, humans as an interdependent consciousness, a consciousness that needs to be reimagined. Colonization was also a theme at the end of the discussion, and Indy Johar discussed its connection to ideas of power. And in this panel, we've come to the moment when it's urgent to discuss issues of access, power, and who gets to call the shots. So Sasha, I would love to start by discussing your most recent book, which is both a toolbox and a framework to think or rethink the agency of design. One of the purposes of design justice is to advance collective liberation and ecological survival by putting marginalized people at the forefront of design and technology practices. Can you tell us more about design justice and how it can be enacted?
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much, Vera, for the introduction and for having us here. So the book Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need was published in March of 2020 with the MIT Press. And it is available as an open access publication. I put the link in the Telegram for those who are following along there. But since the theme of the panel is access, I thought it would be worth noting that book is open access, full text available. And the book is an extensive reflection on questions about the relationship between design and liberation. It's structured really around a number of questions. So after an introduction that's sort of built on a personal story of myself as a trans person moving through airport security systems and talking about the way that that socio-technical system is configured to erase and invisibilize trans bodies and gender nonconforming bodies, as well as Black bodies, Muslim bodies, disabled bodies. It then moves into a series of chapters that are extensive reflections on a series of questions. So the first chapter is about values and looks at the question of what values do we encode and reproduce in the objects and systems that we design. Then there's a chapter on accountability, which is about who gets to do design and how do we move towards community control of design processes. There's a chapter on narratives, which is about what stories do we tell about how things are designed and how do we rescope design challenges and reframe design problems and solutions. The next chapter is about sites, and that addresses the question of where do we do design and how do we make design sites more accessible to those who are going to be most heavily impacted by design processes. And that chapter also includes a reflection on, rethinking which design sites we privilege and which sites we ignore or marginalized. And then there's a section on pedagogy, which is how do we teach and learn about design justice and about other ways of doing design that are more inclusive. So in a nutshell, I talk about design justice as a framework for analysis of how design influences the distribution of benefits and burdens between various groups of people. So again, how does design influence benefits and burdens, the distribution of benefits and burdens of designed objects, systems, interfaces, the built environment between different groups of people. And in particular, the book focuses on how design reproduces or challenges what Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination.
The matrix of domination is an incredibly powerful term. Could you unpack it a little? Because I think it's very important to understand what it means in order to understand what design justice is all about.
Sure. So the matrix of domination is a term that Patricia Hill Collins, who was the past president of the American Sociological Association, towering Black feminist intellectual, wrote about in her 1990 text, Black Feminist Thought. And when she writes about it there, she uses it to talk about race, class, and gender as interlocking systems of oppression. And it's a conceptual model that helps us think about how power and oppression and privilege, as well as resistance, are systematically distributed. So when she talks about the matrix of domination, she's emphasizing race, class, and gender as three systems that historically have been the most important systems in structuring Black women's lives and access to resources and opportunities and so on. And she also notes that additional systems of oppression, could structure people's lives. So, disability, for example, or a colonial relationship. So it's about race, class, and gender, but it's a mode of analysis of thinking about interlocking systems of oppression, how they shape our lives. And also it's a way of thinking about how we could locate each of us in particular bodies. We're located within that matrix of domination somewhere in a way that will shape our own access to life chances, to resources, to benefits, to burdens. And I think it's also really important to note that she talks about different scales of operation of the matrix of domination. So it operates at the individual level, at a community level, as well as at a broader, structural, institutional, and societal level. And so in the book Design Justice, what I'm really doing is taking that concept and lacing it through with design theory, affordance theory, for example, and thinking about how do different types of design systematically structure access, for example, to an affordance in an interface, which groups of people, according to their location within the matrix of domination, are going to be more systematically benefited or burdened by that particular tool. Or you could think about this in terms of the built environment as well. And in the context of the conversation we're having here in this festival, we could talk about the non-human as well, and the location of non-human actors within the Matrix of Domination, the way that, we were just looking at the Feral Atlas, looking at how particular systems of capitalism, say the grid, is structuring different species of bees' survival chances, reducing biodiversity based on modern practices of industrial agriculture. I don't talk about that as much in the book itself, but I love that direction, and I think it would be really fruitful to go deeper there.
So that's one direction, but another direction that I would like to just touch briefly upon is your engagement and criticism of AI and ethics. We've talked about AI and ethics earlier today in a panel around technology, but I know you're very active in this field as well. So could you just elaborate briefly on the work that you've been doing in this field?
I can. I just, before we jump into that, I also want to clarify sort of like the second part of design justice. So on the one hand, it's a framework for analysis, but design justice is also not a term that I created. It's a growing community of practice and practitioners. And so the theory and practice of design justice emerges from this sort of growing network of people who are thinking about how do we reimagine design processes so they don't just reproduce white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and settler colonialism. And there's many overlapping sort of circles of people doing this work. The community I'm working with most closely is the Design Justice Network, and people can learn more at designjustice.org. And that community emerged from actually a conference called the Allied Media Conference that takes place in Detroit every 2 years. In terms of the AI ethics question, so one of the hats that I wear is that I am a senior research fellow with the Algorithmic Justice League. And the Algorithmic Justice League was created by computer scientist and poet of code, Joy Buolamwini, to address racial and gender bias in algorithmic systems a couple of years ago. And there's a film that actually just launched this week. It's screening in more than 50 theaters virtually. And that film is called Coded Bias, CODED bias. And you can learn more at codedbias.com that explores sort of the way that the Algorithmic Justice League was formed and the way that we're thinking about this work. But to me, in that role, I would say that AI ethics, on the one hand, it's important that there is a rapidly expanding conversation about artificial intelligence systems and algorithmic decision systems and what values they are encoding across different domains of life, from labor to employment to transportation to interaction design. Really every domain of life is now being touched by algorithmic systems. Often when we say that, we're talking about machine learning or natural language processing systems. And in some ways, mostly we're talking about statistics, and we're talking about making predictions and classifications based on pre-existing categories and past data sets that reflect historical data. And since historical data is always going to be deeply structured by the matrix of domination, by people's life chances and access, for example, a data set about crime in the context of the United States, where the definitions of crime itself, the categories of what's called criminal, policing practices and the deployment of policing resources have all for hundreds of years been deployed to systematically focus on the capture, disenfranchisement, and incarceration of Black people. We're going to see data sets that predict that Black people are more likely to be involved in criminality. And so automated decision-making systems that are built on those historical data sets will reproduce structural racism through making recommendations about how to allocate police resources, for example, or risk scores for pretrial risk assessment. We've seen a lot of attention to that recently. Unfortunately, I think that the framing of ethics as a way to try and capture that conversation is insufficient and thin. ethics tends to be quickly captured by white cis men who occupy privileged positions in academic philosophy, for example. And so at Algorithmic Justice League, we're interested in harms and talking about what are the harms that are being done to people in the real world on a daily basis by AI and algorithmic decision-making systems. And how do we identify harms, verify them, report them, reduce them, and seek redress on the behalf of people, or how do people who are being harmed by AI every day now, seek to minimize that harm and to redress the harms that they've experienced. And so we think that that's an important frame shift that needs to take place in that space.
I mean, in the end, it's also about liberation. Like you were just saying, also design justice is about liberation. I want to go now to Claudia briefly. Claudia, Sasha's work, it really calls for sort of a challenging of this idea of universalism. This is something you also talk about a lot. And it also talks about an idea that we have to appreciate and sort of encourage also smaller scale initiatives and things that don't necessarily scale up. And Claudia, when talking about smaller scale, could you discuss the work that you are doing in terms of observing and charting and mapping new forms of citizen participation, which maybe are also small scale?
Yeah, thank you, Vera, and thanks, Sasha, also for the introduction to your work. I think there's actually quite a bit of a strong link actually with the work that we're doing at the OECD around thinking about not just citizen participation, but actually about new forms of democracy a little bit more broadly that goes beyond just participation. I mean, as you had said in the introduction, kind of way we're thinking about things is more about the paradigm change, how it could be accelerated to having a more inclusive, more participatory and more deliberative governance. So over the past year or 2 years, actually at the OECD, we've really taken a deep dive into looking at different forms of experiments of innovative citizen participation practices, and in particular, focusing on the types of initiatives that are trying to be more inclusive by design, and also designed in such a way to give people a more meaningful say, and to be able to provide a more informed input into policymaking. So we've been looking at the use of things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, citizens' councils, consensus conferences, the sorts of initiatives that at their heart have a randomly selected group of people who are chosen to be more or less representative of society. So it's a way of trying to bring the kinds of people who won't naturally go to a town hall meeting or participate in an online consultation, or would naturally sign up to be part of something, or would maybe even who don't vote, going out and bringing them into the conversation to the table, giving them the time and the resources to be able to hear from a wide range of experts, to hear from stakeholders as well, to hear from different activists, to hear from one another, because there's a benefit of just having that diversity of people at the table together, and collectively working on developing recommendations for policymakers on really the most contentious and most important and pressing policy issues. So we're seeing things like, for instance, recently we had the Citizens Convention on Climate in France. There was also a Climate Citizens Assembly in the UK. There was the Irish Citizens Assembly that treated 5 different topics, including gay marriage and abortion, which both led to referendums on those topics that were informed by the recommendations that came from citizens. So in a way, I mean, to go back to your initial question about scale, that was a little bit the context for it. I think the way that we're thinking about scale is not necessarily about how can you involve as many people as possible in one of these types of initiatives, because there's clearly a trade-off in terms of the quality you can have of the deliberation of the size of a group, and then the quality of the recommendations and the rigor that they can come up with at the end of such a process. So it's not about trying to involve as many people as possible, because also I think people don't want to be participating in everything all the time. It's more about having meaningful opportunities to participate and knowing other people like you are also participating and having an influence on other important policy decisions. So we've been looking at ways in which these types of more deliberative approaches, where people are randomly selected and have the time and resources to deliberate, are being institutionalized to become more of a normal part of the way that certain types of public decisions are taken. So looking at new permanent deliberative bodies, and looking at the different ways in which, you could imagine having all sorts of ministries, having multiple citizens' assemblies on different issues all the time. So it gets to a point of everyone in their lives either being able to participate or knowing someone else who's participated in really meaningfully shaping policies that are affecting our lives.
I mean, this work was the work that gave rise to the report, Catching the Deliberative Wave, which you were one of the co-authors. It was published in June this year. Mm-hmm. With this report now, this report is a tool that you, as a member of or working for the OECD, this is a tool that then the OECD can really use to sort of like try to push an agenda with governments, with policymakers and so on. Could you tell us a little bit about the report, the initial reaction to it? I mean, you already said this is already being enacted by a bunch of governments in a bunch of situations all over the world, really, because this report had examples from all over the world. Could you tell us a little bit about what are the next steps? I mean, the reaction to this and how you can keep pushing this to push a certain agenda?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the report that we published at the OECD in June of this year is called Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions, Catching the Deliberative Wave. And after this, I'm going to send the link into the Telegram chat as well. It's also available open access, as is the data set. So for that, we had collected 289 case studies of these sorts of citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries that have really taken place all over the world and have been growing really in, let's say governments and public authorities have been using them more and more in recent years, like really since 2010 and more so since last year. So our interest, I wouldn't say partly it's pushing an agenda, but just to be clear as well, the OECD, which stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is an international institution which is made up of 37 member countries. So, myself who works at the OECD as part of the Secretariat, I'm not just pushing my own personal agenda here. This is actually really being driven also by the interest of member countries and also beyond that, in better understanding actually the trends of like, why are governments doing these sorts of processes more and more? Like, why is there a need actually to try and involve citizens in more meaningful ways? And actually going back to some of the points that Sasha made at the beginning about design justice, but how can we think about redesigning our democratic architecture in such a way that we're bringing in more voices from marginalized groups that we're not hearing in the way our current democratic institutions are designed? How can we redesign the system to remove some of those incentives that come with elections that prioritize getting reelected over the public good, that prioritize short-term thinking over long-term thinking? So I'm not suggesting that these are intended to replace elections, but it is a complement to a system of representative democracy that at the moment tends to prioritize certain things, and those are all design decisions of this is why we have such a system in place, and why we have certain power dynamics that get reproduced, why we have certain policies that get implemented and enacted. Because when you have a relatively unrepresentative group of people in terms of demographics who are elected members of parliament in many countries, it's no wonder that policies tend to turn towards a certain direction as well. So I think there's also something qualitatively different that comes from having that greater diversity of being involved in collectively working on coming up with new solutions to the collective problems that we face.
I mean, I see definitely a lot of overlaps with the strategies that Sasha was just referring to, but I think Sasha also wanted to ask you a couple of questions about deliberative models. Sasha.
Yeah, I have two questions, about some of this work, and one is a framing question, and it's just kind of a language question. It's around the language of citizenship. And I think that it's important to think about how, when we talk about trying to develop models for participation beyond the traditional models of electoral politics, I personally like the language of residents of a particular geographic area rather than citizens. And it may have a very different valence in the EU context than in the US, but since the anti-immigrant discourse is such a key part of the right-wing politics in the US, but I think also in the EU context and increasingly globally, I think we need to be careful when we deploy that language, even though citizen could just mean a resident of a city. I think it's often used by the right in other types of ways. But
yeah, definitely. Yeah. Can I just come in on that? Because it's a super good point, and it's something we talked a lot about in terms of the framing of the report. There's actually a pretty substantive section at the very, very beginning in one of the first pages around definitions and the language that we use throughout. And one of them is to really be precise about the fact that we're talking about citizen in that like civic sense, and not in the sense of the nationality or the passport that they're holding. And very often, I mean, I don't want to say always because I don't actually have the data for that, but I would say almost always, if not always, it is residents who are the ones who are chosen from. So it's not like there's a kind of nationality restriction, but I do take your point that it's also just about the language and the use of the word citizen itself. I don't know, resident participation maybe doesn't have the same ring to it. And I also think that that civic aspect is something that is quite important and to be emphasized in all of this too, that we all also have our civic responsibilities. And that doesn't necessarily come with just being like a passport holder of that country.
Sasha, you had a question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, I know that you're already having that conversation, but just so thank you for clarifying the way that that's being thought about in that space. The other question I have is maybe more substantive. It's like about the model of sort of random sampling participants in these sort of, I think it's a really interesting model, and I think there's a lot of value in it. What I wonder about, or I'm curious to hear the conversations that you all are having about this, is there's a way in which that approach also, it continues to kind of center all of the power in the state. And I think, again, this may be like between the US and the EU context, where here, it's a question about trust in the state and democratic institutions and so on. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is we have debates, certainly in the Design Justice Network, around participatory processes and the value of bringing in sort of individuals who are likely to be impacted by a particular design process. And that approach, either in addition to or as an alternative to bringing in people with organized community-based groups, civil society organizations that already exist, and in particular sort of neighborhood level or city level, tenants' rights organizations, for example, when you're discussing how a particular policy is going to impact people's access to housing. And I think that there's been a lot of pushback here on participatory processes that are run by city agencies and that bring in only sort of unorganized individuals, because a lot of times the social movement organizations or community-based organizations will have much more sort of developed analysis or language and proposals. And that can cut both ways, because sometimes it's, groups that have most access to resources within the Matrix of Domination that have the time to develop the proposals and bring them and try and move them through a city process. But also, movements, organizations from the left and below get cut out of an individualized city-led process if it's random selection of the individual. So I'm curious about what's the space for social movement organizations that already exist in that type of process.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really good question, and something that I'm glad I can clarify for people watching as well, because the idea with having a randomly selected group of citizens at the heart of these processes is not by any means to cut out organized groups or civil society or any other stakeholder. It's to perhaps change the role that those groups play within the wider decision-making process. So it's, you know, the organized groups will still always have a chance to have their say and to be able to also, you know, present their point of view, but instead of presenting it directly to the policymakers, they're presenting it to the citizens, who are then considering that amidst all of the other evidence and presentations from other stakeholders that they're hearing from, as well as the perspectives they're all bringing to the table. So it's not to cut those out, it's just that, you know, they play a role as I suppose, bringing a form of evidence into the discussion. And the aim of having random selection is that, I mean, usually it's in opposition to how other participatory processes are designed, which means that they're often open, which sounds good, but in practice, we know, and there's a lot of research which shows that it tends to be certain demographics that disproportionately participate, which tend to be male, white, well-educated, well-off, more urban, etc. So having the random selection is not only just about bringing the voices we don't hear to the table, but actually also drawing on the evidence that exists from different fields of psychology and business and political science, which shows that actually just that having that diversity of perspectives leads to better decision making than having a more homogeneous group of people, which is why it's also better to have that rather than just hearing from some of the organized groups or from some of the groups that are already active, because they tend to have access to similar evidence and are more likely to be reinforcing, you know, their own points of view rather than also bringing in new ideas and new perspectives, which are, I personally think, important to hear when we're talking about collective public problems which affect society more broadly. Yeah,
definitely. I wanted to ask, going back to this idea of civic sense and participation, I wanted to go back to something. In the first day of the conference, we saw an excerpt of the statement that Sasha sent over to the festival, which I'm just going to quote. He said, "There are so many articulate and powerful movements that are active. We don't have a crisis of imagination. We just need to figure out how movements can take power, shift policies and institutions so that we can have survival in a planet that is more just." And this leads me to the question, how can design justice be applied at a policy level? I mean, we're talking to Claudia here, and we already had these questions that you just asked her. Can we institutionalize these processes at a local, regional, national, federal level of government? And how would that look like?
I mean, I think that is the question. In the last section of the book, I spent some time trying to think a little bit about what it would mean to move design justice through different types of institutions. And I think that there are already a number of attempts to move design justice into city planning processes. And I think that there's also the private sector, and thinking about what does design justice look like inside powerful companies. So I think that both of those are going to be important. I will say that in the US context, there is a large and very well-organized and growing group of people thinking about design justice in urban planning, led by a group of Black architects and urban planners called the Design as Protest Collective, or the DAP Collective. And so they've developed a set of 10 design justice demands for architecture and urban planning as professions. And a lot of those demands, some of them are for individual firms and architects. So things like, we shall no longer participate in the design of prisons, jails, and detention centers. But a lot of them also apply to, city policy. Like cities will no longer participate in the use of what's sometimes called, defensive architecture, or sort of these city level approaches to make urban space safer through features of the built environment that tend to penalize poor and homeless people and so on. So the classic example would be, putting, arm barriers in the midst of a bench so that a person can't sleep on it. So I think that there's a conversation happening already, but I'd love to know, you know, what others think about this. I'd love to know, Claudia, what you think about whether design justice principles could be brought into policy spaces.
Yeah, definitely. That would be also my follow-up question to Claudia, and also maybe touching upon the fact that, Claudia, in your work that led to the creation of this report, you already were working with designers, curators. So from the OECD side, you are already integrating these kinds of voices into decisions that bring about then these kinds of reports. So if you could also touch a little bit upon that, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of actually the working methods of how we wrote this report and did the research and everything, it was quite a collaborative effort with the OECD's Innovative Citizen Participation Network, which has around 80 practitioners, designers, curators, policymakers, and academics. So it's a multidisciplinary group of people. I mean, Vera, you are one of them. Jan Bullen, who's also involved with this festival, is also one of them. So trying to bring in voices from different disciplines, different perspectives, different countries as well. It's an international group of people who were involved in helping us shape the scope of the research question, give us kind of leads with the data collection, reviewed the report at different stages, both like in a discussion format when we all met in person to talk about it for a full day, and also on various iterative drafts of the writing. So this has been quite important to be kind of living the principles we are preaching about here, in terms of making sure there's a diversity of views and perspectives that get into it. But going back to this question that you were raising earlier, though, about institutionalization, I do really want to, you know, let's say hit this home, because it is something that we're really going to be working on, well, are still working on, and is one of the main focuses of our work in this area after we published this report, which, you know, in the end, through the data we found was really the fact that there's a lot that's been happening in this space in terms of different public authorities and governments experimenting with more deliberative ways of involving wider diversity of people in shaping policies, but they tend to be one-off and ad hoc initiatives that depend very much on the political will of those who are in power at that time. So how do we shift from that dependence on political will to something that becomes incorporated into our institutions, both when it comes to like the legal and regulatory changes that might be necessary to do that, but also in terms of shifting the social norms, so that even if there is a political shift in power, that those legal changes continue, because we've seen that there can also be backsliding even when we've had the legal changes, if that cultural shift and social shift is not happening at the same time as well. And I know we're kind of close to the end of time, but I think I want to just briefly touch on one really exciting example in this space, which I hope will be inspiring not just to the policy world, but also to citizens in thinking about, you know, what is actually the kind of democratic change we could be pushing for beyond just changes to our electoral systems and our voting systems, etc. And that comes from a small region in Belgium called Ostbelgien, which is the German-speaking region, has around 80,000 people, but it has its own regional parliament, regional competencies. And in February 2019, the parliamentarians there unanimously from all of the political parties voted to put in place a new democratic institution called the Citizens' Council. And this Citizens' Council has 24 randomly selected citizens who have an agenda setting role. It's up to them to decide what are the 1 to 3 issues every year that should be put to citizens' panels. And each of those citizens' panels is also a deliberative process in itself, with a randomly selected group of people that has to have a minimum of 3 months to be able to learn about and deliberate on a topic and to come up with recommendations that then go to the parliament. And the legislation now requires the parliamentarians to have at least 2 debates on those recommendations that come from the citizens panel and to respond to them. And the Citizens' Council now also monitors that that actually happens. So, you know, I know it's a little bit of a complex thing, but I think it's a nice example to show about how we can be thinking about complementing what is at the core still our representative democracy, but in such a way that gives citizens a meaningful say to decide what issues should be up on the table for discussion in the first place, and then given the time and resources to actually come up with really in-depth, rigorous, detailed recommendations that go beyond what would be top of mind opinions, or even just individual opinions and things that have to be thought about collectively, which I really think is one of the other key things that differentiates deliberative democracy from other forms of democracy and participation. This fact that you're getting people to work collectively together to find the common ground between them. I really think we need more of that, and why I think that these forms of democratic innovation in particular are particularly inspiring.
Well, I think that's a great end to our conversation. And just before I lead us to the Q&A so that we can think collectively with the Telegram chat maybe, and then further together in the future, I just want to say maybe Sasha would be a great member of this OSCE.
I think so too.
I will invite Barbara to join us here, and maybe she's going to bring some interesting feedback from the Telegram group. I just think it's a great way to finish with this idea of collective thinking. Thank you so much, Sasha. And Claudia, let's listen to some Telegram questions, Barbara.
Thank you very much, dear Vera. And also thank you so much, Sasha and Claudia, for making your thoughts, but also your research and your work accessible to us. So thank you very much. And yeah, so it's my turn to make some voices accessible to you. There was actually kind of a critical voice that might pick up right where you ended, Claudia. So say yes to the collective process. But Jurian says it is not enough to go from local only to national or federal. Solutions can only be realized and maybe first found by larger transnational legal bodies. At least that's one opinion. And it was followed also by, or precursed by the question, no one can really control the big corporations in this world. So what does it make sense to talk about civic participation if it ends in national politics? That's a critical question there.
So I don't know who wants to start. Claudia.
Well, maybe I'll start on that first question and I'll leave the other big question to Sasha then, but I can jump in on it after as well if we have time. I mean, first of all, I should have said that amongst the 289 case studies I was talking about, that's actually from all levels of government, and 3% of those are from the international level. So initiatives that were done either at the EU level or actually internationally as well, related to UN initiatives that happen. So I mean, I think that we need these sorts of innovations actually at all levels of government, because we have different issues that are better dealt with closer to people at the local level, and other issues that, of course, we need to be thinking about more collectively, transnationally. So I think I would sum that up as it's not an either or, we need it at all levels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that it's related to the second question about the role of transnational corporations. I mean, yes, of course, transnational corporations are extremely powerful actors on the world stage, and they're some of the most important actors in the climate catastrophe and ecological crisis and devastation. At the same time, I think it's a mistake when we let the imaginary or the discourse of the transnational corporation erase the reality that they are institutions that are transnational, and they also operate in the real world in local spaces and places, and they're composed of people largely, as well as machines and processes. But, you know, so for example, I think we would have to talk about a particular company in a particular context and what it is that we're trying to move. But I could share one example, which would be facial recognition technology. And that's because that's something that I'm working on right now through my work with Algorithmic Justice League. So these are technologies that are being developed by many different actors, including extremely powerful transnational companies like Microsoft and IBM and Amazon. And recently, you know, I think there's been a shift from the sort of unchecked development and deployment of facial recognition technology, in particular face surveillance systems, unchecked deployment of face surveillance systems, and giving unfettered access to local law enforcement pretty much everywhere, And that's now been shifting through a mix of national and transnational policy initiatives. The GDPR has implications, and there are other EU-wide legislative, policy initiatives that rein in some of that power. And in the US, although we haven't been able to move a federal bill yet, city by city, we're passing bans and moratoria on law enforcement use of facial recognition surveillance systems, or at the very least, putting some controls on them, requiring court orders or warrants from a judge to deploy them, banning them outright in other cities. In some places, in San Diego, actually, just the other day, maybe yesterday or a couple days ago, the strongest municipal ban on face surveillance technology was just passed through, social movement mobilization and a community coalition of 40 or 50 organizations that got together to say, we don't want this stuff deployed either by private actors or by the city government. And so we now have more than 10 municipalities in the US that have been putting some checks on this stuff as we build towards national level action. And ultimately, we'll need transnational agreements on the deployment of that. So it's contextual. We have to pick an issue area and a firm and act at multiple levels.
And actually, if I could jump in on that, because I think facial recognition is precisely one of those issues which might seem very technical at first or from the outside, but is actually very much underpinned by values questions and questions about what kind of society do we want to live in. And I think is one of the types of questions where deliberative processes are particularly helpful or useful, because it's about weighing all of these different trade-offs and asking, if and under what conditions, and lots of more nuanced complexities need to come into that picture. It's not black and white of just yes or no, always or never. It's really, unpicking that and trying to figure out where is some common ground in society on this. And maybe that could be different depending on the context of a place as well. And I think that actually in France, one of the MPs has called for a deliberative process precisely on facial recognition. So nothing has been announced or anything like that, but there is a movement to really get citizens involved in thinking about this alongside parliamentarians.
Yeah, cool. You just tied this discussion beautifully to the discussion about technology we had earlier. So thank you very much for that. Due to time, I'll just finish my Q&A input with a very short question from Andreas, and it was directed to Claudia. He asked, during COVID, many governments have organized hackathons in order to have the civil society participate in solutions. Are you looking at this kind of participation as well? That was kind of the question.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, for a bit of the wider context, the team that I work with at the OECD, we work within the open government team, and we work with our colleagues who work on digital government and public sector innovation. And I would say it's been more of a collaborative effort actually between all of us to be looking at all of the different ways in which governments have been looking at involving citizens and civil society more broadly in terms of figuring out how different aspects of reacting to the COVID emergency. So there have been some deliberative initiatives, there have been some hackathons, there have been, some more broader online-based participation and so on. And I think we're not yet at a stage of having analyzed all of it and having a sense of what has actually worked or not, because I think we also need to be able to take a critical step back and not these initiatives are not actually always designed in a way that is helpful. And I think we have a bit of work as the community researching and analyzing these trends to still have some synthesis of it, but definitely looking at it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I know that you will both be joining the Telegram chat where you're already in, so thank you so much. Vera, do you want to have the last word before I show us to the next program?
Sure. I just want to say thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you so much, Sasha. I'm very thankful that you will continue to think together with us for a little bit while longer in the Telegram chat. And thank you, Barbara. Go ahead, take us to the next. All
right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And please stay with me in the Zoom just for one more second, because I just have the pleasure of introducing an artist who, together with a lawyer, actively fights for a more just and self-determined mode of access. So that ties it really beautifully to what we've just discussed. And yeah, Peter, you can take us to the action of collectivizing Facebook. Thank you very much.
Welcome to this session with artist Zhou and the human rights lawyer Jan Vermon, who we will meet later via video message. Thanks for being with us, Jonas.
Pleasure.
I followed your work for quite some time, and what can I say? I really admire the way in which your work mobilizes art circuits and other political forms, often in new kinds of assemblies. And we just had a good time together in the Zoom waiting room. And I don't know, sometimes the Zoom waiting room is like the kitchen party. It's like where the really nice things happen. So it's a real pleasure to also meet you finally. So today you are with us to present your latest project, Collectivize Facebook, that you have developed with human rights lawyer Jan Vermon, who we will hear later via video message, as I already said. And after the presentation, we will share a couple of questions from the Telegram group. So I do invite all of you in the group to send questions throughout the session, and I will try to relay them to Jonas in the end. And I think with that, I will hand over to you, Jonas.
Thank you, Julian. I'm going to share my screen with you in the meantime. Thank you for the introduction. It was indeed the Zoom waiting room is the best alternative for a kitchen talk at this moment. I enjoyed it very much as well. And thanks to everyone for organizing the festival and for inviting me. The title of the presentation that I want to share with you is Stateless Parliaments, Utopian Training Camps, and Collectivizing Facebook. Collectivizing Facebook being the main focus of this short presentation. I want to respond quite directly to a question that is central to this part of the program of Driving the Human, namely who has access to knowledge and participation. That has been an important question for me as well throughout my artistic work, although I would like to reformulate the question a little bit into who has the access to the means of production of knowledge and participation, and how can artistic practice contribute to reclaiming and redistributing these means of production of knowledge and participation. Now, I engaged these questions very directly in the realm of political representation in the context of my artistic and political organization, New World Summit, which I founded in 2012, and consists of various members from the field of art, architecture, design, progressive diplomacy, and law. And with the New World Summit, we try to create alternative parliaments, temporary parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organization. And that started as a direct response against the ongoing war on terror that uses designated lists of terrorist organizations to enforce limits to access democratic institutions. So let's make it very concrete. Being placed on a blacklist, being placed on the designated list of terrorist organizations, it means one's passport is revoked, travel ban is imposed, bank assets are frozen. Essentially, one is declared stateless, which is a kind of double negation because many organizations placed on so-called terrorist blacklists are already stateless. If we think, for example, of the Kurdish revolutionary movement or the government of West Papua in exile, and here you see some examples of struggles for autonomy and self-determination of groups who have faced blacklisting in a similar way and that we have worked with throughout the years. More importantly, the dominant narrative of the war on terror, that the so-called terrorist is driven by some kind of pure hatred against enlightened Western democracy, is fundamentally wrong for more and less obvious reasons. Many blacklisted organizations stem from long-standing anti-colonial liberational struggles and rather represent ideas of democracy that are too democratic for capitalist democracy to bear. When it comes, for example, to questions of fundamental redistributions of wealth, colonial reparations, these are fundamental issues that capitalist democracy is not capable of computing or of responding to in a structural way. So over the years, we developed various chapters of the New World Summit to challenge this dominant narrative, this us versus them dichotomy that was central to the war on terror. asking the question, is it possible that we, as politicized citizens of states that are waging the war on terror, have more in common with organizations prosecuted in the war on terror than with the criminal states that claim to speak and act in our name? So in a way, we also have tried to redefine this notion of terrorism, not applying necessarily to blacklisted organizations, or certainly not exceptionally, but more importantly to the terrorist actions of nation states in the context implicated in the context of the war on terror. In other words, the different morphologies, the visual, spatial, and performative spaces of our alternative parliaments, and I showed you a few examples in the meantime, they became a space to recompose what constitutes, what defines us in this us versus them dichotomy. And you will note that in that process, we put a lot of emphasis, a lot of investment in how different geometrical and spatial configurations of these alternative parliaments also contribute to a different appearance, a different manifestation of collectivity, and a collective exploration of new shared narratives to break this dominant storyline of the war on terror, this dominant us versus them dichotomy. Now, the most recent chapter of the New World Summit was commissioned by the Democratic Self-Administration of North Syria, better known as Rojava, means west, refers to the western part of Kurdistan. It's an autonomous region in the northern part of Syria, where an alliance of Kurds, Arabs, and Assyrian peoples have developed a model that they refer to as stateless democracy, a model that essentially tries to separate the practice of democracy from the structure of what they consider the patriarchal, nationalist, and capitalist identity form of the modern nation state. So instead of applying centralized political systems, stateless democracy in this region, in the Rojava region, is based on local communal self-governance with a strong emphasis on gender equality. And the public parliament that we were commissioned to make, a parliament as a public space in collaboration with the autonomous government, was inspired by this model of stateless democracy. And it translates visually, morphologically, into a parliament. It's literally a public parliament. It's not separated from the public domain, but it co-constitutes the public domain. The center of power remains empty, and instead the spatial emphasis lies on collective self-representation of the local communes gathered in the space. So to return to the central theme of this part of the program, in the process of developing the New World Summit since 2012, we moved in a way from challenging the means of production of knowledge and participation in the context of the war on terror to trying to create, in direct collaboration with liberational political movements like the one in Rojava, new infrastructures of collective presence. So it's less about means of participation in terms of representation. It's more about creating spaces where it becomes possible to reclaim a collective presence on one's own terms, on one's own self-determined terms. An attempt to contribute to an idea of a new stateless internationalism, you could say as well. Now, in the case of the New World Summit, challenging the means of production to knowledge and participation, it takes the form of the stateless parliament. In a recent ongoing project titled Training for the Future, that I developed together with dramaturg and curator Florian Malzacher, it takes the form of a utopian training camp. A kind of neo-constructivist training camp that you see here, that we developed in the former industrial remnants of the Ruhr area. And a camp that we created at a time in which we collectively face various intersecting political, economic, and environmental crises. A time essentially in which the very idea of the future, or the very possibility of a future history, is structurally and systematically being undone. The future is being dismantled. And here, in a way, we gathered in these remnants, these ruins of a future past, an industrial future that promised us victory over nature, but that essentially has become represents the very extractive modes of production that have undone the very possibility of a meaningful future, a meaningful form of future survival. In this training camp, for a period of 3 days, at least in the most recent chapter, the second chapter in 2019 of Training for the Future camp, we gathered for a period of 3 days trained 10 hours a day with 20 trainers consisting of futurologists, progressive hackers, extraterritorial activists, transnationalist art activists, training 450 trainees focused on reclaiming the means of production of the future. Reclaiming the means of production of the future in a time of dystopian normativity, in which imagining a future that in any form or way is better would be a progression from our current predicament seems impossible or unimaginable. So that included trainings, for example, in intimacy encryption by Heath Bunting to develop intimate knowledge amongst fellow activists that can be used as an alternative code to resist interrogation. So it essentially approaches the idea of encryption not in the kind of digital sense as we tend to use the term, but really encryption in terms of my profound knowledge of you allows us to have a set of references that no one else knows or understands. And even in a severe situation as that of an interrogation, we can use this intimate knowledge of each other to communicate and pass messages to one another. Another example, training by the ISD, the Initiative Structure mentioned in Deutschland, together with Global EV, in developing new common decolonized historiographies to dismantle ingrained racialized narratives and values, creating new common timelines, and of course, engaging or recomposing past historiographies is also inherently part of enabling the possibility of alternative futurities. Here you see an example of a training by the Army of Love that focuses on redistributing intimacy and love, even with those who we feel no particular personal connection or desire for. So it's a training that also critiques the lack of engagement from the history of socialist movements with redistribution of love, always focused on more material conditions, but not on these intimate conditions of redistribution. If we decommodify objects and products, could we also decommodify our very intimate relations between one another? Example of a training by the Kurdish women's movement that uses Augusta Boal's methodology known as the theater of the oppressed to dismantle patriarchal mentalities and behaviors. In their words, the training was aimed to kill the dominant male, the kind of dominant male mentality, as well as more physically engaged oriented trainings here, one by Public Movement in exploring choreographies of state violence. So to understand, take temporarily the position of states in relationship to protests or uprisings, to understand the gaze of the state in relationship to the activist, while other trainings focused on developing alternative forms of protest choreographies, thinking more from the thinking of mass protest or mass mobilization, popular movements, as something that embodies a choreography in and of itself, or that can be considered as a form of choreography, has its own dramaturgy in the way that it is trying to collectively pre-enact or embody or visualize alternative futurities. So in this context, in the context of the utopian training camp of Training for the Future, challenging the means of production of knowledge and participation is embodied in what seems this very hierarchical terminology, trainer and trainee. But an effective training or a successful training essentially turns a trainee in a potential trainer, because there's a transfer of an embodied knowledge from one person to another, or from one person to a temporary collective of trainees. And as such, it's a way of spreading, redistributing tools and methods of producing alternative futurities across new communities and constituents. At the end of the training camp, a trainee is essentially, or could essentially, become a trainer. Now, these two examples, the stateless parliaments of the New World Summit, the utopian training camp in Training for the Future, these are direct responses to the aggressions and failures of existing institutional structures. The failures of the war on terror when it comes to guaranteeing fundamental principles of democratic participation and a right to representation, a right to presence, even. The failure even of our existing cultural institutions to be able to reclaim the very idea of the future as something that we can collectively engage and reclaim our stakes in. They are examples, the examples I just gave, to try to engage the field of art to develop alternative infrastructures. But there's, of course, I realized in the process also a risk in responding to crisis always by intensive attempts to create new infrastructures. Because simultaneously, it seems we seem to be at a moment where it's also essential to wage a struggle for common infrastructures that have been taken from us, or infrastructures that were never common but should have been common from the start, or because of our engagement with them. But I'll try to make that a bit more concrete in relationship to the collective action lawsuit Collectivize Facebook that I developed together with human rights lawyer Jan Vermon. Was commissioned by Hau, Hebel am Ufer Theater in Berlin. And the lawsuit that we've been working on in the past 1.5 years will be submitted at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva in September 2021. So the central part of this work is the indictment. The indictment we drafted against Facebook, in which we argue that Facebook infringes upon the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals in various ways. To give you a very quick overview of where this argumentation comes from, Facebook instrumentalizes users as neo-feudal data workers. Our data, our effective labor as data workers essentially constitutes Facebook's profit model, even though we are not remunerated for it, except maybe through having simply access to the platform, even though the term access could be challenged in and of itself. Facebook is obviously used in various surveillance capacities that infringe upon privacy and further impacts democratic elections in disproportionate ways. And data capture targeted campaigns of companies like Cambridge Analytica have been a recent, more known example. And the corporation has willfully advised authoritarian regimes, such as that of Duterte in the Philippines. And Jan Vermon will elaborate in a bit on these arguments in more detail. For now, I think it's important to emphasize that the core of our overall argument relates to the very structure of ownership of Facebook. Our argument is that the very ownership model of Facebook is what essentially undermines our individual and collective right to self-determination, and thus our capacity to shape our own fate. And Jan will elaborate in a moment why this emphasis on the right to self-determination and which has been or is a foundation of the Charter of the United Nations. Therefore, our demand is to have Facebook recognized as a public domain. This is the first demand that we bring forth with our indictment. And the second is the demand for a consequential transfer of its ownership to the 2.5 billion active Facebook users active on the platform today. As unpaid data workers, we worked for Facebook and now we must own it. It's time to socialize social media. Now, to clarify, to collectivize Facebook does not mean to reform Facebook or to nationalize Facebook. Our aim is to turn trillion-dollar companies into new models of transnational cooperatives, collectively owned and collectively governed by their users. This is a potential pathway to create transnational unions that go beyond the corporation and beyond the model of the nation state. In the months ahead, Jan Vermon and I will organize various pre-trials to introduce our indictment and invite publics to join our case as co-claimants, but also to invite witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible if we win the case. So we do not ask witnesses to reaffirm the argumentation that we developed in the indictment. We ask witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible when we have proven victorious. And witnessing the future is an essential part of our case because while our indictment aims to provide a model to reclaim common ownership over trillion-dollar companies, not only Facebook, but also Bayer or Alphabet, Apple, and Amazon, that still leaves open the question how we would govern these infrastructures, these trillion-dollar companies collectively as transnational cooperatives. What would be the decision-making structures, the social contract for 2.5 billion co-owners of Facebook, rather than simply being users of Facebook? Do we ensure encryption, ban algorithms? Do we decentralize servers? Or do we even dismantle the entire infrastructure of Facebook as a whole, considering its heavy reliance on extractivist industries? But before we go into that more speculative, essential but more speculative component of the lawsuit, let's first look at the legal pathway that lawyer Jan Vermon has developed in order to be able to submit this first indictment against Facebook to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in the first place. So in case you would like to read along with Jan, who will be elaborating on the indictment in a moment, I would like to ask you to go to the website collectivize.org, so collectivize.org. And when you open the website, you scroll down, you will see in the column on the left, the text, read the indictment. There's an English and there's a German version. I would like for this occasion to ask you to open the English version. And that will open a PDF which contains the full indictment that we drafted against Facebook and which Jan will be speaking about more in a second. Now, if you share the objective of this collective action lawsuit, you can join us by scrolling all the way down to the website to the section Join as Co-Claimant. We already have thousands of co-claimants to this lawsuit. When we will file it at the council, it will not carry the names of Jan and me. Only it will carry the names of all the thousands of people that have joined the lawsuit, this collective action lawsuit, because we need to make a collective case for the collectivization of Facebook. This today is our invitation to you to reclaim the means of production of knowledge and participation in the context of this particular initiative. Now, companies like Facebook, Amazon have seen their quarter numbers grow enormously in the period of the coronavirus pandemic. And that shows that essentially our crisis is their capital, their chance to expand their monopoly positions even further. So apart from creating alternatives, as I have tried to do in collaboration with many different political organizations and movements, for example, through the alternative parliaments or the training camps, we must also simultaneously reclaim what we have already worked for. What we have already worked for as unpaid data workers, we have a right to own what we ourselves have created. So for those who want to read along, I hope in the meantime you had a chance to go to collectivize.org and to have the indictment at hand. I will now hand over to human rights lawyer Jan Vermon to lead us through the indictment.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jan Vermon. I'm practicing law in Brussels in Belgium. I was asked by Jonas Staal to draft an indictment for violation of fundamental rights by Facebook, a giant monopolistic player in the new data economy. I will walk you through the legal argumentation from the beginning, starting with the introduction, which showcases that the data industry plays an essential role in today's economy. Data are considered as the new oil. Collecting, processing, and exchanging data has become one of the main pillars of today's economy. In part 1, on page 7 of the indictment, in the section called Facebook's Monopolistic Position and Hegemonic Ambitions for Information Exchange and Communication, information is provided on the central role Facebook plays in this area. 2.2 daily billion users of the Facebook empire, which includes applications such as WhatsApp, Messenger, etc., receive, disseminate, or exchange information. They generate through this activity a tremendous amount of data that are subsequently mined by Facebook. This has allowed Facebook to become the 5th or 6th largest private company in the world. Facebook has a profound impact on many aspects of our daily life. Amnesty International describes Facebook as unavoidable for most of the world population, especially the youth. In part 2, on page 10 of the indictment, in the section entitled Facebook and the Potential for Influencing or Manipulating Political Choices, we documented a never-seen capacity to influence public opinion, to promote or censor ideas, to influence elections. Facebook has the ability to steer social movements either by promoting them or by curbing them. And Facebook does not hesitate to work with authoritarian regimes. A clear example is the Duterte presidency in the Philippines. The Cambridge Analytica scandal shows that the data collected by Facebook can be siphoned by obscure alt-right structures to spread their toxic agenda of hatred and division. We take note of the fact that Mark Zuckerberg solemnly declares that this has happened against the will of Facebook and will be avoided in the future. However, we also know that Zuckerberg or his successors might change their minds overnight if the prospect of the profit rate is high enough. Here is another parallel with the corona crisis. In a column published on the US media Truthout, Noam Chomsky argues that the corona crisis can either lead societies collapsing into authoritarianism or alternatively to rethink the problems of capitalist society and develop new forms of democratic, economic, political and social systems. Many governments are imposing severe restrictions to certain civil liberties, arguing that such restrictions are necessary in the fight against the coronavirus. While certain limitations, for example to the freedom to circulate and to meet with others, can be understood in times of corona crisis, extreme vigilance is necessary to make sure that such limitations will not be perpetuated once the health risk is over. Control over data plays an essential role in the risk for authoritarianism. That is illustrated by the extreme example of the Israeli program, which of course in the name of the fight against the coronavirus allows the Shin Bet, a secret service, to use the location data of mobile phones to determine the whereabouts of each and every citizen. In part 3 of the indictment on page 19, the influence of Facebook on labor relations is discussed. Facebook has invented a new form of forced labor, with some striking similarities with servitude under feudalism. Through their activity, Facebook users unintentionally create the raw material. Facebook takes possession of these resources and processes them. The new oil is taken away for free from those who produce it. Since we are in a position of dependency towards Facebook, we are mechanically led to generate data for the algorithm, as we just need to connect, talk with our friends or post a photo. In short, we are forced to provide Facebook with an activity that does have value. Thousands of pages have been written about the risk of Facebook for the right to privacy. Most court cases conducted until now throughout the world have concentrated on this issue. Of course, we deal with the question of privacy in part 4 on page 24 of the indictment. We think the general awareness of how deep Facebook penetrates our privacy is still very insufficient. On the pages 24 and 25 of the indictment, we explain, for example, the mechanism used by Facebook to build so-called shadow profiles, in which very detailed information is collected about Facebook users who did not accept to share their contacts with Facebook. By combining information provided by others who did accept, Facebook knows as much about you as if you gave the authorization yourself. In the indictment, we refer to some spectacular examples of how Facebook has reconstructed some of the most intimate episodes of the private life of its users. There is thus a global and severe underestimation of the peril posed by Facebook to the right to privacy. But there is, on the other hand, at least some consciousness about it. That is one of the reasons we concentrate in the indictment on other and less known aspects of the peril posed by Facebook to fundamental rights, whether it be people's rights or human rights, individual or collective rights. The international covenants on civil and political rights on one hand, and on economic, social and cultural rights on the other hand, were both adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 16th of December 1966. In their common Article 1, they state that people have the right to self-determination, that is, the right to freely determine their political status, pursue freely their economic, social and cultural goals. Text says, I quote, "All peoples may for their own ends freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principles of mutual benefit and international law. In no case a people may be deprived of its own means of subsistence." End of quote. Peoples must be able to decide their own fate and future in order to exercise their right to development. Control over the new oil data is decisive for the question how we can build in the future a world economy that protects the majority based on solidarity and cooperation. But it is also important for the immediate questions arising from the corona crisis. How jobs can be saved, how incomes and savings can be protected, and how new medicines and vaccines produced and made available to all. How can this be achieved if the essential raw material of the new data-based economy is under the control of a few private-owned monopolies? This is the red thread of our indictment, drafted, of course, before the corona crisis broke out. Our conclusion in part 5 of the indictment on page 28 was and remains that in order to protect people's rights and human rights, the data giants need to be under a probably new and to be invented form of public control and ownership. The right to self-determination, the right of every people to control the levers that allow to choose freely their future, is the mother of all rights. Control over resources is essential to assure an economy that guarantees the right to work, to housing, to healthcare, to access to culture for all. Control over information and channels to receive and disseminate information is absolutely essential to build a real democratic society, to fight the development of anti-democratic alt-right agendas. As said, data play an essential role in these questions. That is why we concentrated in the indictment on the menace posed by Facebook to the right of people to choose freely their destiny. We argue that it is impossible for states and even for international organizations such as the European Union to effectively control giant private interests such as Facebook by regulating some of its activities. Only full democratic public control and ownership can make structures as Facebook to be powerful instruments for human development and emancipation. We are aware of the challenges ahead. National courts, no more than governments or institutions such as the EU, can impose such public control over Facebook. National courts can at most impose some restrictions on the most outrageous excesses committed or made possible by Facebook. And we also know that in a global market-based economy, where the principle of private ownership of production means is sacrosanct, controlling transnational corporations is anyhow extremely difficult or impossible. That is why we turn with our indictment to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which has been designated by the international community as the guarantor of the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 2 subsequent international covenants. We certainly do not have blind confidence in the Human Rights Council. Therefore, we will submit our complaint to this body, but we will not give it out of our hands. We demand that the Human Rights Council includes our indictment in their agenda and adopts our argumentation to recognize Facebook as a public domain and subsequently recognizes the need for users' ownership over the platform. Further, this argumentation will need to be structurally applied to other monopolies as well, whether this regards Alphabet, the parent company of Google, Microsoft, or Amazon. But we are also aware that only a protracted social movement throughout the world will create conditions in which states and international bodies will effectively act. Our aim with this indictment is to contribute to these 2 lines of struggle, the legal struggle on one hand and the social one on the other.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation, Jonas, and for sharing that film. We have now actually quite a bit of time for questions still. And there are a couple of great questions coming through from Telegram. So one starts like this. Dear Jonas, thank you so much for your work and engagement on behalf of all of us using Facebook. For the sake of debate, I will ask this critical question. Now comes the question. Many people on Facebook are using it to disseminate conspiracy theories or even racism discriminatory or violent content? Do we really want to collectivize a social medium, social, with them? And of course, it's a polemical question, but also serious at the same time, it says. So I guess the question is Facebook worth making into a collaborative enterprise? You know?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's a question, though, that relates that you could apply to any form of collective governance, or let's say any structure that is supposed to represent common interests. We can say the same about current democratic elections. Do we really want to participate in democratic elections where the alternative for Germany is spreading conspiracy theories, xenophobia, racism, together with all of its other ultra-nationalist and authoritarian fellow parties emerging across the European context and the world? I think the question is, what is the social contract based on which, in this case, you engage in the process of collectivizations? What are the checks and balances? What are the basic principles that ensure equal representation, the banning of racism, of sexism, of patriarchy? This is, of course, a huge part of the work. How do you compute in infrastructures are not neutral? How do you compute within these infrastructures themselves a possibility, or how do you compute values in the principles in these infrastructures that undermine the spreading of racist or conspiracist rhetorics? And of course, then you always get into another difficult realm, that is then who decides what is to be considered hate speech and what is not. But I think on that point we've been excessively relativist, and it's extremely important. Maybe also following the example of the Kurdish revolutionary movement, the example I gave of the autonomous government in Rojava, their social contract when it comes to gender quota for the participation of women, quota for equal representation of different minorities from the region, whether Assyrian, Arab, or Kurdish. On a very structural way, their social contract ensures that it is impossible to exclude particular voices or enforce dominant, nationalist, patriarchal forms of exclusions.
Thank you for that answer. And I think the next one kind of follows from that in an interesting way. So the question goes, yesterday we heard of John Thackeray's notions of islands of coherence. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, Jonas, but basically that's Thackeray's way of pointing out that there are sort of areas, models, and initiatives that can be found within dominant structures where alternative ways of configurations can be trialed and tested and maybe grow from there. So the question comes now. Can you say a bit more about the role of art in creating such new alternative infrastructures and how it maybe might be different from other domains? And I'm going to pull in another question that is related. Could you say something about the relationship of law and art in this last collaboration? So I guess, what is the role of art in making these kinds of new alternatives, and how do you collaborate with other kinds of knowledge forms and political forms in the process?
Yeah, thank you. Also great questions. I think when it comes to the role of art in developing alternative political infrastructures, as I tend to do, I think the importance, I think art and politics are very closely connected, that our conception of art and the validation of art, also even the funding of art and the infrastructures of art, there's always a political relation, whether that is to private money or to the role of governments. You can't really separate the two, but it doesn't mean that they are the same. And I think artistic competence relates very strongly to imaginative competence. So a capability, or at least a space that we can use or engage to push the possibility of what organizations could be beyond specific constraints of the present. So I think that the spaces that I, or we, because many of them emerge from collaborations, try to create, whether it's the parliaments or the training camp or the collective action lawsuits, they are attempts to be with one foot in the real and one foot in the possible. The real, of course, of the collectivized Facebook trial is the indictment that Jan and me worked on for a year to develop the kind of the precedent and the strategy of the legal strategy of our approach. And then the speculative component, the possible, relates to the way that we try to engage with this notion of witnessing the future. Imagining that being able to place ourselves in the position of saying, we have won the trial, now, what does it mean to collectively govern, to translate these infrastructures, trillion-dollar companies into transnational models of transnational cooperatives? And so for me, this is where the role of art is crucial, or artistic imagination is crucial, to somehow push that one step further of possibility and to create spaces where you're with one foot in that possible reality, to kind of agitate and mobilize the desire to make it real, to bring it closer to the reality that we are presently occupying. When it comes to the relationship between law and art, working with Jan is a very interesting experience, because Jan is what is known as a progressive lawyer, but he will be the first to say that that's in itself a contradiction. He would argue that law by definition is conservative, that it is about trying to remain a particular normative conception of reality, and that the paradoxical role of a progressive lawyer is to find new ways of interpreting, to actually unleash possibilities through law, for which the law itself was meant to never make happen. So the history of law, of European law, certainly has everything to do with the protection of private property. So essentially, our demand to transfer ownership of Facebook seems fundamentally against the very reason why we have a system that we understand as a system of law in the first place. But then in history, throughout history, particularly that Article 1 of the UN Charter that Jan elaborated on in his presentation, the right to self-determination, that is a law that came in the process of the anti-colonial struggle, the right to self-determine one's own fate, one's own structure of governance. It's very different from this kind of regime of human rights, which is much more about replicating a particular generic liberal or capitalist democratic idea of society with international monitoring to make sure that free trade agreements and the role of the World Bank are all, that these accesses are all smooth. So he's also trying to find entry points in the history of the law, unexpected principles of law like that of self-determination that can somehow subvert the very interests that the law was meant to preserve. And in that sense, I see something in his way of approaching law in creating this space of possibility through rereading, subverting, hacking in some sense, an existing legal infrastructure. I see a lot of links with the way that I approach my own artistic practice.
Thanks, Jonas. Unfortunately, we already have to draw to a close. There is one more question that is, I think, quite great. I'm just going to try to make that question into a bridge to the next session, because I think in some ways that will also answer the question. So, because after this, we're closing this whole session with our last performance by Vivien Tauchmann's performance series Self as Other Training, Household. And I thought that the notion of intimate encryption that you mentioned earlier actually speaks in really interesting ways to Vivien's performance series, you know, and the way that her work really forces us to decrypt in a way and take on different kinds of intimacy. And I think that's also something that happens in your work in a different way. You work with these kind of political structures that don't immediately evoke embodiment, but then, as you wonderfully explained in your presentation, the body is, and working with the body and intimacy is a really interesting, important part of that work. And with that, I would like to thank you for your presentation and for your important work. And Moritz, could you take us to Vivien?
Thanks for having me.
I would like to ask you to please stand up wherever you are at the moment. For the next couple of minutes, I want you to move your body by following my movements and the instructions.
Stand straight. Form hands into fists. Move hands to the front while keeping one hand further in front of the other. Keep hands aligned. Bend back slightly. Stretch aligned hands slightly forward. Move arms and upper body even back and forth, while moving slowly to the side. Repeat continuously. Stand straight. Spread legs slightly. Bend upper body slightly forward. Move hands to the front. Form hands into fists. Move hands parallel into one vertical line. Move hands to one side of your upper body. Move your hands up and down, up and down, up and down. Move your hands in front of your upper body. Move your arms steady from one side to the other, while moving slowly backwards. Repeat continuously.
Repeat again the other routine. Repeat again the other routine. Repeat the other routine continuously. Repeat again the other routine. slowly stop your movements and return to your screen.